This morning is the 15th session in our series on evangelism and apologetics. And Lord willing, we're going to dive into a consideration of Islam this morning. The first thing we need to do, though, is to finish lessons 13 and 14. And I think I just have maybe 2 or less blanks. So if you want to get out your lesson 13 or session 13, 14 handout, I'll go through the second step in comparing worldviews. Is everybody with me? All right, I want to assume you're with me. So the second step in comparing worldviews, well, let me just review for a moment. So if you recall, there were 2 broad steps that I shared with you in how I think we ought to compare our worldview with that of the unbeliever. The first was to perform an internal critique of the unbeliever's thinking by walking through the 4 points that we had discussed prior to that. The 4 points being looking out for arbitrariness, looking for unargued philosophical bias, looking for incongruous presuppositions or dialectic tensions, we called them, within the unbeliever's worldview, and then lastly, recognizing that he lacks the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience. It's great that we can just boil that all down now and you understand what I'm talking about, right? That's great. So that was the technical way that we had put summarizing Christian apologetics, and then I gave you 2 steps, the second step of which was setting forth the Christian worldview as, 1, the context for dealing with the unbeliever's objections. Does everybody have that one? The context for believing or dealing with the unbeliever's objections. Anybody not have that? Raise your hand. Okay. That was the first of the first part of step 2. The second part of step 2 was setting forth the Christian worldview as that precondition for the intelligibility of human experience. And you recall we went over 14 items that are necessary elements or aspects of a worldview that accounts for human experience, such as love and science and mathematics, all the things that we take for granted often throughout the day. And then the third part of setting forth the Christian worldview as the context for conflict resolution and redemption. And I don't think I talked about that one. Does anyone have that filled out already? Okay. Is everyone awake? All right, very good.
Tony, I've kind of got lost in my notes here.
Okay. So we're on the last page of the handout that you've been using before today.
Yeah, but what did you just ask?
It was the third part of step 2, which is we want to set forth the Christian worldview as the context for conflict resolution. Did you already have that filled out? Okay, great. And that's when I said we need to be focusing on the major tenets of Christianity, that if we're going to have a resolution to the competing philosophies in the world today, people have to repent and become a Christian. All right, so with that, we're going to turn to Islam because it's a huge subject, one that deserves much more than 55 minutes on a Sunday morning. Unless anybody has a question, please review those 14. The last blank I have is context. Context for conflict resolution and redemption. Is there another blank? Okay. Redemptive, an intelligible worldview. I looked at that statement and I thought, well, I probably already said that before, so I don't want to repeat myself. An intelligible worldview must be redemptive. Okay, and so again, please review those 14 items. Think about those things, and I can promise you it'll be helpful as you defend the faith. I'm going to be meeting with a professor of religion tomorrow, an acquaintance of Cynthia Burris, and I doubt we only have 2 hours, I think, to talk, but we probably won't get into a whole lot of this stuff, but I promise you it'll be helpful. It'll be helpful for me in the future with this guy, since he's a philosopher. So anybody, Andrew, do you have today's handout? Do you have, Andrew needs a handout. So today we're going to be discussing Islam. We're going to be applying the presuppositional apologetic method to the worldview that many Christians and non-Christians believe is the greatest opponent or strongest adversary to Christianity. But I believe that Michael Butler, who was one of Bonson's students, rightly assessed the Islamic worldview as a paper tiger when all is said and done. On Friday of this last week, Larry sent to most of you, if not all of you, a video clip. Raise your hand if you watched that. Very good. Okay. Was that surprising to anyone? What was in that? Okay, Leslie's shaking her head no.
It was to me the first time. Of course, I sent the written form of it
Right.
several months ago to you.
Yeah.
For asking that.
Okay. Well, lest any of you think that the narrator or producer of that video was just a fear-mongering whack job, I want to share with you an article that was published at Philly.com. If you go out to Philly.com, if you want this article, you could go out here and then type in the search field Rick Santorum. I learned of this article through Dr. White's website. On February 12th of this year, there was an article published out there by Mr. Santorum entitled "The Elephant in the Room, Intimidating Critics of Islam," the subtitle of which provides the thesis of the article, and that is, "Politicians and citizens who raise questions about the religion are targeted." And so I want to share, it's a real short article, so I want to share with you this story. We lost more than 1 million jobs in the past few months, the headlines remind us. So last month's story about a Dutch court's ruling that Geert Wilders, if that's how you pronounce his name, I'm not sure, was, quote, inciting hatred and discrimination, unquote, and that, quote, it is in the public interest to prosecute him, unquote. So that story, understandably, he says, didn't make the American news. Is anyone familiar with this story before I proceed? Okay. Did you read it out there at Philly.com, Lucas?
The Dutch guy?
Yeah.
No, I've read it several different places.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, good. Well, since there's just two of you, I'll continue. So this guy, Wilders, to paraphrase, he produced a 15-minute film called Fitna, and Rick here says it suggests a direct link between certain verses of the Quran and acts of terrorism. And so the UK banned this man, this member of the Dutch Parliament, from entering their country. And the reasoning was his, quote, presence in the UK would pose a genuine, present, and sufficiently serious threat to one of the fundamental interests of society, unquote. And that was a letter from the Home Secretary of England. He went on to say that Wilder's statements about Muslims and their beliefs, as expressed in your film, Fitna, and elsewhere, would threaten the community harmony and therefore public security. And I agree with him. In 2007, Cambridge University Press destroyed unsold copies of Alms for Jihad after it was sued by Khalid bin Mahfouz, a Saudi-Irish businessman whom the book accused of financing al-Qaeda. And he says, so much for academics standing up against book burning. And then in 2005, you remember the story about the comics that were posted in a Dutch newspaper, which led to riots and burning cars and Muslims threatening to kill the cartoonists. And then last year, anybody familiar with Mark Steyn, the British author? Okay. He was forced to defend himself against charges of racism and Islamophobia that were filed with 3 Canadian human rights commissions based on his columns in Maclean's magazine. And then in 2008, last year, there was a UN resolution urging nations to outlaw, quote, defamation of religion. And then several nations, including Italy, France, Netherlands, are attempting to ban hate speech, they call it, against religious groups. Of course, if that ban was enacted, then nobody could ever criticize anyone's belief because everybody's beliefs are religious, right? That's something we've learned in this class. We can no longer say anything negative about anyone. So all of these incidents are calculated to intimidate critics of Islam in Europe and across the West. The message in the European Union is clear. Politicians, religious figures, and even private citizens with religiously and politically incorrect opinions will be subject not only to Muslim protest, but to criminal prosecution and violent retribution. And then Mark Stein says, pretty soon your little book is looking a lot less commercially viable. At the end of the day, there will be a lot of American books that will go unpublished here in America. What's a book that we really like, we value a lot? That the Bible. Yeah, I didn't even finish the sentence. That in the Bible, if the homosexual radicals were to get their way, the Bible would be banned, because it's very clear in the Bible, in the Old and New Testament, that it is an abomination to God, homosexuality. And so that would, of course, be seen as hate speech. In addition, these incidents deflect attention from the real, rather than trumped-up religious discrimination. In the arena of actual persecution of religious minorities, Arab and Islamic nations are much of the problem. All of us, I think, with half a brain know that. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that fact. And then Rick discusses the report on international religious freedom that was produced by the U.S. State Department in 2008. He says, among the dozens of limitations on religious freedom in the Arab Islamic world are the crimes of apostasy, converting from Islam to something else, and blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad, both punishable by death under Sharia law. Coptic Christians are at best second-class citizens in Egypt. This was a statement that resonated with me because when I was in Egypt in 2006, I talked to a janitor for a while in the hallway, and he was a Coptic Christian, which is a heretical organization, but nonetheless he claims he's a Christian, and he told me in no uncertain terms that he'd like to immigrate to America because it's very difficult for him to keep a good job there because he's discriminated. Baha'is are savagely persecuted in Iran, and churches and synagogues are banned in Saudi Arabia, as is any non-Muslim religious activity in public. This is not a front or even back page story in the American press today. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the economy, he says. Last sentence, or a couple sentences. The gathering storm I have been warning of for years has now formed over the West. Yet instead of fighting the gradual incursion of Sharia, which is the law code of Islamic states, and the demands of an intolerant, even militant Islam, Westerners are cowering and fatalistic. Last year, the Archbishop of Canterbury conceded that acceptance of some parts of Sharia in Britain seem, quote, unavoidable. Very disturbing. And he says, so how did the markets do today? It's a great article. If you're like me, I save everything that's worthwhile in my favorites, and so I have an Islam folder and tons of articles like that. Okay, and I'll give my criticisms, which are very minor, to that video you watched here in just a moment. Now, if you would, get out your session 15 handout, and we'll begin to go through that. According to a brief illustrated guide to understanding Islam, it's a small book written by a Muslim named I.A. Ibrahim. He says Islam is, quote, the acceptance of and obedience to the teachings of God which he revealed to his last prophet Muhammad. And I give the reference there and encourage you to get that. It's really cheap. It was free for me because I had a ministry to Muslims for a while in Dallas, and so they gave it to me. The term Islam means submission. The term Islam means submission to the will of Allah or God. The word Allah, just to note here, occurs more than 2,100 times in the Quran, which is about the size of the New Testament. You guys may see this Quran here on the lectern. This is large and about the size of a Bible because, one, it has notes from the editor, Yusuf Ali, and it also has the Quran. It has the actual Quran. It has the Arabic, because there is no non-Arabic Quran. All English or other language interpretations, they're called, of the Quran are just that, because the only Quran is Arabic. So One who submits to the Islamic view of God's or Allah's will is called a Muslim. In Aramaic, the language which Jesus spoke pretty often, God is referred to as Allah. So Arab Muslims and Arab Christians both use the term Allah when referring to God. So don't let the term itself bother you. If you were a Christian and you spoke Arabic, you would call God Allah, which is most woodenly the God. And so don't perpetuate sometimes what I hear in the news, or you hear some Christian pastors even saying, God is not Allah. Well, he's not the Muslim conception of Allah, but don't dog a Palestinian Christian if he calls God Allah. Okay, and so contrary to the narrator of the video that you saw, Allah is a religion, because is there a worldview that's not a religion? Anybody? Every worldview is a religion, right? And Islam is also a Christian cult. Now, does that surprise anyone that I said that? It's okay. Okay. I think I'll be able to prove that before we end today's time together, that Islam is a Christian cult. According to a 2000 book on world religions that I have, there are about 1.3 billion persons in the world today who profess to be a Muslim. The world population right now is about 6.9 billion. Islam began in modern-day Saudi Arabia, yet non-Arab Muslims today now outnumber Arab Muslims by a ratio of 5 to 1. So it's false to call a Muslim an Arab. You should not do that. It's a gross overgeneralization.
Can you please define Arab?
Someone from the Arab region of the world, like the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Arabia.
But Turkey wouldn't be.
I don't think you would refer to Turkey as Arab.
United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, that would qualify. Yeah, the UAE. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to over 260 million Muslims. Sub-Saharan Africa, and in Indonesia, which most of you probably already know, is the largest community of Muslims in the world with about 170 million. There are between 2 and 10 million Muslims in the United States. That's a pretty wide range, because depending on who you listen to, you hear those numbers. Between 2 and 10 million Muslims in the U.S. And then for you students, Joe, anybody else who is in college, there are over 20% of the international students in the United States studying at universities come from 40 Islamic countries. If you attended a university in the past 10 years, that should be no surprise. Statisticians and demographers estimate the size of the Muslim world will be 2 billion by 2020. 2 billion with a B by 2020, and that rapid growth is largely due to birth rate. It's not due to amazing, successful evangelistic crusades on the part of the Muslims. They are not evangelistic, by the way, except perhaps maybe in the prisons, which is where they get a lot of their new recruits. So they have a high birth rate. I guess you could say they obey Genesis 1:26 or whatever that, 7, 8, somewhere in there. Raise your hand if you work with a Muslim. Okay, 1, 2, that's it. I'm surprised. I do, so I should raise my hand. Work with a Muslim. Okay, Lee works with a doctor or more that are Muslim. And raise your hand if you've ever gotten to share the gospel with a Muslim. Okay, Tim. Okay, it's good. Several of you. Very good. Okay, so evangelical missionary, just more about Islam before we get into refuting it. In fact, we're going to refute Islam in about the last 10 minutes of this, believe it or not. You're thinking, boy, he's confident. Evangelical missionary outreach to the Muslim world, however, in spite of all of the growth, has been for many years, and it continues to be meager, very meager. In 1987, only about 300 Protestant missionaries were in the Arab world. that region of the Middle East where a whole lot of Muslims, professing Muslims, live. The figure hasn't grown much in the past 20 years. I couldn't find another figure past 87. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. How many of you are familiar with the Joshua Project? The Joshua Project? Wow. Okay, no one. Well, it's on your handout. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, but I can't remember where.
Okay. You probably came across it on the web when you did a search. It's on your handout, joshuaproject.net. I strongly encourage you to check out that site. Very helpful. Among other things, the organization, it tracks the progress of evangelical missions in the world. All 16,302 people groups. They claim that there are 16,302 people groups today. Yesterday, I printed out a breakdown from their website. I did a search on Middle East and North Africa, and it's really impressive, all the data they have out there and how reached or unreached a particular people group is. If you ever need a boost in your prayer life for missions or just to be encouraged to maybe go on a mission trip, go out to the Joshua Project and see how few people have ever heard the gospel. Anyway, I did a search on the Middle East and North Africa, and the percentage of evangelical Christians living in Bahrain, Egypt, and Qatar is between 2 and 3%. 2 and 3%. They have the most Christians. The percentage of evangelicals living in the other 16 countries in the 19 that the Joshua Project groups into Middle East and North Africa, the percentage of evangelicals that live there, less than 1%. And if those facts don't break your heart, there's something wrong with your heart. That's very sad. Oh, okay. Piper, not surprising. Real heart for the lost, real heart for the nations. John Piper. Yes.
Is the number reporting about missionaries that you got, is that because the restrictions that they have in Muslim countries against evangelism?
That's part of it.
Okay.
In Saudi Arabia, for example.
You can't just say.
Right.
You think that's people just working there? Oil company people, that kind of thing?
The number of Christians.
People in the statistics.
Um,
Just working there.
I'm sure a good number.
Indigenous people who aren't Christians.
Yeah. I don't think the Joshua Project, at least in this report, is giving you missionaries. It's just the number of, it just says percentage evangelical, so it's probably just the Christians who live there versus the quote-unquote full-time missionary. But Joe, anybody else who's young and more mobile, or if you're older, even if you have a family, I would encourage you to think about being a missionary to somewhere in the Middle East. It's an amazing place. I could have studied there for a long time. I only had 3 weeks when I was over there. Move to Israel. There are very few Christians in Israel. Let's see. Yes, they give the number here, 0.2%. Israel is ultra liberal. The Jews there aren't Orthodox. You'd have a heyday. And it's not as dangerous as Saudi Arabia or other countries. So be thinking about that. Islam is probably the fourth largest religious denomination in the U.S., trailing Roman Catholic, Southern Baptists, and Methodists. And it's growing. So very large Muslim populations exist in most European cities. In the UK, Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, many churches are being turned into mosques. Is anyone heard that before? Okay. And so my point in giving you this information is that the churches of the Lord Jesus Christ, including this church, had better get busy dealing with Islam, learning what Muslims believe, and then refuting them as you evangelize them. Yes?
I was thinking about something I saw in Iran. Wouldn't you admit a lot of these people that profess to be Islamic are just culturally Islamic?
Yes.
That as far as the ones that are truly, know the Quran and so forth, they're a minority. The group of
Yeah, and
There's a hunger for the gospel in Iran of all places you would have never thought, you know. But when they hear the gospel, they're open to it. It's not like they're cut his head off. You know, he's telling us about Jesus.
that's right. Everybody hear what Vernon said about the openness to the gospel. And so many of the people who live there are not wanting to bludgeon you when you start talking about Jesus, whom their own book claims is a prophet. They're not at all. And in my experience, most Muslims are like a lot of Christians. They really don't know what their religion entails, what they are supposed to believe. When I first, the only conversation I've been able to have with the Muslim with whom I work, I asked him about, I said, have you read the Bible? And he hadn't. And I told him, well, that surprises me because your own book tells you to read the Bible. And he was a bit surprised. So that showed me he's probably not as knowledgeable of his religion as he should be. Again, same case with most Christians. So Islam is an ever-growing population bomb and geopolitical bomb. The narrator of that video was certainly correct. If you study Islamic history and read the Quran, their goal, like the goal of Mormons, is global domination. It's not so much the conversion of your hearts, they want you to submit. It's submission, Islam, submission to the will of Allah. Bernard Lewis, a non-Christian, non-Muslim scholar of Islam, he gave a speech in 1989 at Princeton University. His speech was later published in the Atlantic Monthly. Anybody receive that? The Atlantic Monthly. It was published in 1990, just a year later, as an article entitled "The Roots of Muslim Rage." And here is the article. It's free if you want to go download it from the internet. "The Roots of Muslim Rage," Bernard Lewis.
Just do it Google or you got a site?
You can just go to Google.
Okay.
Yep. And in the article, you learn, among many things, and by and large, it's a good article, I thought, you learn that enemy of God, according to Orthodox Muslims, is a noble term. Through the U.S.'s support of Israel, its occupation in Middle Eastern countries, and the exportation of its debauched culture, America has become the arch enemy of Islam. The author discusses why do Muslims, many of them, hate the West, in particular the U.S. He says our backing Israel really is only a small source of Muslim rage. Economic materialism, he thinks, is the reason that many devout Muslims hate America. They hate our way of life. The porn, the greed, the arrogance, the idolatry, the infidelity everywhere you look, the condoning, if not encouragement, of infanticide. They hate that. And I'm right there with them. I hate it too. And so does the Lord, of course. So there's a good reason they hate the American culture, because it's debauched. Yes.
Tony, I once went to hear Palmer Robertson, who's quite an Old Testament scholar.
Right.
Who wrote Christ of the Covenants in Israel. And one of the first remarks he made was he has actually founded a seminary somewhere, I think in Africa or somewhere. But anyway, that one of the real problems they have in preaching the gospel to some of these people is because they associate America with love of Israel, which is carried out by the dispensationalists.
Right. Yeah. Everybody hear that? Larry was talking about how this O. Palmer Robertson, Old Testament scholar, had set up a university or a seminary.
Yeah, I forget exactly where, somewhere in Africa.
And they have real trouble with evangelizing the Muslims because of the United States' support of Israel. Christian Zionism. Just want to read one statement on page 9 of the article by Bernard Lewis. He says, ultimately, the struggle of the fundamentalists is against two enemies, the fundamentalist Muslims. I call them Quranic Muslims. Ultimately, the struggle of the fundamental Muslim is against two enemies, secularism and modernism. The war against secularism is conscious and explicit, and there is by now a whole literature denouncing secularism as an evil neo-pagan force in the modern world and attributing it variously to the Jews, the West, and the U.S. So anybody who's not a Muslim is an enemy of God. Now, your coworker probably won't tell you that, more than likely. Of course, Orthodox Christians believe the same thing, don't we? We believe that all non-Christians are at enmity with the Lord, Romans 8:7. They're God haters. But we don't arrive at the same course of action, do we? In relation to what we do with unbelievers. The rage of Muslims against the West, our continent, and Europe is based on worldview differences. This goes without saying. Quranic Islam permits the killing of infidels, including Jews and Christians, provided Muslims have offered them the way of Islam first. In the end, the Quran endorses the eschewing of apologetics for killing. Islam in history has never been spread on a large scale by apologetics or reasoned discourse. Never. It's typically been spread by the sword. As an aside, has anyone read Robert Spencer's The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades? Okay. Is that on your handout? Okay. You should buy that and add it to your library. Islam has always, as I said, been spread by the sword. So when you begin a dialogue with Muslims, earlier I mentioned that in Dallas, when I lived there, I had a ministry to Muslims for about 14 months, which was great. It was wonderful, and I wouldn't be standing here today had the Lord not ordained that ministry. When you begin a ministry with them or just a one-on-one conversation, you need to secure a commitment from them to reasoned discourse, to being rational, and to considering evidence. Okay. All right, there are two major Muslim sects, S-E-C-T-S, two major Muslim groups, the Sunnis and the Shiites, whom we've all heard on the news. The former group, the Sunnis, it gets its name from their belief in the authority of the Quran, and the Sunnah, or the customs of Muhammad. The Sunnah is comprised of hadiths, H-A-D-I-T-H-S, sometimes you see it H-A-D-E-E-T-H-S, hadiths. And the hadiths are the sayings and conduct of Muhammad and his companions. And my sources for all of this stuff was Islamic texts. I mean, I would hope that if you look at the book by Sproul and Abdul Salib or any other Christian who's written on Islam, you're going to find an accurate representation. But I encourage you, if you do study the Quran, get you a Quran with notes like this one here by Yusuf Ali, or this one here, which is actually produced by the Institute of Islamic Knowledge, which is here in Houston. And so you can get it from the horse's mouth, as they say. Yes?
Is it true that in dealing with reading the Quran, the original language, they say that is actually the best way to read it? Because a lot of the subtleties and things that they might not want to interpret into English, do you find that these are pretty faithful as far as some of the negative, what we as Christians or the West would consider negative aspects of Islam, or are they softened a bit?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know Arabic, but I have found them they don't gloss over the verses that would be very offensive to us. In fact, this was a gift by one of the Muslims, and it's about $40-50, so it's nice. Very nice of them. So Sunnis comprise about 80% of the world's Muslim population. Shiites, 80% of the world's Muslim population. Shiite Muslims believe in the authority of the Quran alone, and they make up about 15 to 20% of the Muslim world. The ex-wife of my former boss and the owner of the company for which I worked in the Woodlands, she was a Sufi, a Sufi Muslim. Anybody ever heard of the Sufis? Okay. Twirling. The Sufis are considered by Sunnis and Shiites to be the way we would look at the Gnostics, the Sufis. It's a mystical branch of Islam. They're very small in number. I don't know if they would call them a cult, a heretical branch of Islam, but they're similar in many ways to the professing Christian Gnostics that may have threatened the Colossians, believing that mystical religious experience is primary, and that the secret meaning of the Quran, the gnosis, the secret knowledge of the Quran, it takes precedence over the surface meaning. We probably know some Christians like that, don't we? Who they don't want to just follow what the book says, but they got to get some sort of mystical knowledge from it. And so you have the Quran and the Hadith for the Sunnis and the Shiites. You just have the Quran. Yesterday in an email, Larry mentioned Psalm 2, and I read it last night, and I thought, we're going to talk about that today. Psalm 2, 2 through 4, the psalmist says, "The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel against Yahweh and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heaven laughs, the Lord scoffs at them." And some of the sayings and the practices of Muhammad and his companions in the Sunnah are indeed laughable. And I think it is permissible in apologetic debate to embarrass your opponent. Now, they'll probably be embarrassing what you're going to share with him from the Sunnah because he doesn't know them. Now, they may not be embarrassing. There are some aspects of our theology that a lot of people might consider to be embarrassing, but it's not embarrassing to us. But you should know that the Sunnah teaches things like Adam, the first man, was 90 feet tall, and that if you fall asleep while praying, Satan urinates in your ears, and that the sex of a child depends upon which parent climaxes first. So this supposedly, at least according to the Sunnis, is infallible revelation. But we quickly learn that there's a lot of superstition in the Hadith. And it's valuable to bring out these sorts of things, not simply to embarrass them, but to ascertain, are they really committed to what they claim to be their authority for faith and practice? All Muslims, Sunni, Shiites, Sufis, others, they believe Muhammad was given the final revelation of Allah or God from the angel Gabriel in a monologue. Their doctrine of inspiration is different than that of Christianity. The revelations that Muhammad received between 611 and 632 AD, 611 and 632, are now, we're told by Muslims, what we have here in the Quran, in the Arabic form only. There's another article in the Atlantic Monthly from 1999. Do I mention this in your outline? Okay, you might want to write this down. The Atlantic Monthly, 1999. What is the Quran? Very good article, in my opinion. What is the Quran? Quran, and I'm not going to say any more about that. There's a lot of debate. Muslims will have you believe that maybe one, Islam is monolithic. There's not all these SECTS sects within it. And they'll also have you believe that we have no doubt as to what is the Quran. Well, that's just false. Yes? K-O-R-A-N. Good question. K-O-R-A-N. So the Quran, the title of the Muslims' holy book, it comes from an Arabic word meaning to read or recite, to read or recite. And so the Quran is considered to be a body of recitations. So the angel Gabriel gave to Muhammad recitations, verbatim. Okay, so and again, this is not enough time. Maybe later on Wednesdays we could do some classes on Islam. There's a lot more to say. What are some basic teachings in the Quran? Notice I bolded some. What are some basic teachings? One, the central tenet of Islam is that God is one. So Muslims are monotheists. Most of you, if not all of you, already know that. Surah 112, verses 1 to 4. A surah in the Quran is a chapter reference. A surah is a chapter. Surah 112, verses 1 to 4 say, He, Allah, is one. Allah is He on whom all depend. He begets not, nor is He begotten. And none is like Him, unquote. So He begets not, nor is He begotten, language with which we're familiar. Jesus is not God. So if you read from chapter 5, verse 72, they do blaspheme who say, quote, Allah is Christ, the Son of Mary. But said Christ, so Christ supposedly said, O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord, unquote. Whoever joins other gods with Allah, Allah will forbid him the garden, and the fire will be his abode. There will for the wrongdoers be no help. So the sin of shirk, as it's sometimes called, is unpardonable. So linking or saying Jesus is God, I remember one time talking to some Muslims, not the ones in Dallas, but on some door-to-door evangelism, and they said, oh, our religions are really pretty similar. These Muslims were saying that. And I said, well, I believe Jesus is God. And they go, oh. So you immediately put the line in the sand, because that is just blasphemous to them. So Muslims also reject the biblical doctrine of the triune nature of God, though, as you'll see in the Quran, was not as understood well by Muhammad. If you read in the same chapter, Surah 5, verses 73, 75, and 48, they do blaspheme who say Allah is one of three in a trinity. For there is no God except one God. So right there you can see there's a misunderstanding of the Trinity. There's not three gods, right, in biblical Trinitarianism. From their word of blasphemy, verily a grievous penalty will befall the blasphemers among them. Why turn they not to Allah? You can notice also the style of English, more of the Elizabethan English in the Quran. So if you're not used to reading that, you fumble it sometimes. Why turn they not to Allah and seek His forgiveness? For Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. Christ, the Son of Mary, was no more than a messenger. Blasphemy. Many were the messengers that passed away before him. His mother was a woman of truth. They had both to eat their daily food. See how Allah doth make His signs clear to them. Yet see in what ways they are deluded away from the truth. So Muhammad thought he was correcting the error of the day, that Christ is not divine. He's just a messenger. He's just a mere man, like the other prophets. And then verse 48 of that same chapter. To thee we sent the Scripture in truth, confirming the Scripture that came before it, and guarding it in safety. So judge between them by what Allah hath revealed, and follow not their vain desires, diverging from the truth that hath come to thee. To each among you have we prescribed a law. We, there's the royal we, so we is a reference to Allah. To each among you have we prescribed a law and an open way. If Allah had so willed, He would have made you a single people. But His plan is to test you in what He hath given you. So strive as in a race in all virtues. The goal of you all is to Allah. It is He that will show you the truth of the matters in which you dispute. The second belief or basic teaching we'll look at this morning is Muslims believe in literary revelation from God, which is obvious because I'm reading from their revelation. Chapter 9 of the Quran, chapter 9, verse 15. Surely we have revealed the reminder, or the message in some translations. Surely we have revealed the reminder or the message, and we will most surely be its guardian. Another translation reads, Indeed, we have sent down the Quran, and surely we will guard it from corruption. So 4 of the prophets of Islam received a book. 4 of their prophets. The first, Moses. Moses was, according to Muslims, a prophet of Islam. He received the Torah, the Taurat, as you'll see in Arabic. David received the Psalms. Jesus was a prophet of Islam. He received the gospel, not the gospels. And lastly, Muhammad, the capstone or chief prophet. Although interestingly, you'll find that a lot of Muslims revere Christ. I think I said this during the Middle East presentation. Well, they revere him, but he did more miracles, they'll say, than Muhammad. So there is something special about Jesus to them. The third belief, given the second belief, it follows that Orthodox Muslims believe in prophets, none of which were divine, including Jesus. Yes, Kim?
Muhammad received the what?
The Quran. Yeah.
And that's the capstone of Revelation.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they believe in prophets. If you read Surah 33, chapter 33, verse 40. Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets, and Allah has full knowledge of all things. So Allah has sent 124,000 prophets to all the nations of the world to ensure the message that there is only one God is broadcast to every person. A lot of prophets. Muslims claim many biblical characters were prophets. Adam was a prophet, Noah, Abraham, Solomon, John the Baptist, the ones I mentioned earlier, Moses, David, Jesus. You're probably starting to see why I say Islam is a Christian cult. The fourth, Muslims do have a doctrine of salvation. Man is born without a sinful nature and he freely chooses to violate Allah's law. And then to remedy that infraction of the law, he must atone for his own sins by sincere confession and good works. So it's a works-based religion. So that's true, but even the most pious Muslim, this is similar to Roman Catholicism, can know, yet not even the most pious Muslim can know in this life if he has been good enough to enter paradise or heaven at death. The only exception to that, as you probably know, is the martyr. If a Muslim dies in the act of jihad, as defined by the Quran, some of what is done in the name of jihad is not jihad. If a Muslim dies in the act of jihad, he immediately enters paradise where he enjoys the pleasures of 70 virgins. Yes?
What about female Muslims?
I thought of that when I was writing out these notes. They get the shaft. I don't know what female Muslims are awarded with. Yes?
Would you clarify the act of jihad?
Yeah, holy war. If you open up any text like that one there, it'll talk about jihad. Jihad is usually, and most often, simply a struggle against sin. It's not primarily a reference to violence against someone else, but it includes that. If it's necessary to increase the kingdom of Islam by the sword, then so be it. But first, the way of Islam must be offered. It's not permissible for someone, at least in my studies and what I've heard from Muslims, to strap bombs onto your chest and walk into a convenience store and blow it up. Yes?
One of the things that was a big issue, and Gary Moore was talking about it, but I didn't get a chance to track it out, was that the Quran actually allows for young boys, not just virgins, for the martyrs, those who are brought into paradise. And it was a big case in the Islamic world that they went through, and they, I guess, gentlemen proved that in the Quran that's acceptable. And I haven't got a chance to trace it back, but knowing that DeMar tends to make sure he references a lot of his stuff, it was kind of shocking to me.
Mm-hmm.
That would be something in Islam that would be even pat in the next life acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there'll be a lot of things when you're studying the Quran that are surprising to you. Yes?
So then the definition of the only way that they would say you could get to heaven is through jihad, in which
of Islam.
Okay.
Yeah, if you just went in and blew up a bunch of people, how is that seeking to promote Islam? Because, I could go blow people up. Yes.
What would be an example of the struggle against sin, like in the act of jihad? I mean, while you're committing adultery, and you
Uh,
died, have a heart attack, would you?
An example of jihad would just be, say, you're a male and you're thinking about lusting after a woman, you're going to struggle against that.
And if you died while struggling against whether you should.
No, in that case, that you're not a martyr in that case, right? You're just struggling against sin. So if you're engaging in jihad as it's typically defined, which is a struggle against sin, that's not going to give you immediate entrance into heaven or paradise. You still don't know, as a Muslim, if you will enter paradise, unless you're a martyr who dies.
So where are all these scholars trying to explain this to all these people blowing themselves?
So you understand what I'm saying, Kim?
No.
So there's
What is an act that I could die into, or they could die into, enter heaven? What's an example of an act of jihad?
if you were, say, in a state that was being oppressed, which you're in any state, we'll say France, and the laws of that land were oppressing Islam, a case could be made that you need to revolt against those laws. And if in the process of revolting you died, then you would be a martyr.
So it could be a struggle against somebody's sin against you.
Yes, and if they were doing it violently, you could respond in like manner. And if you died in the process, there would be, and if you were male, you'd have this award.
So if these people who just die in the struggle of sin, but not a martyr, do they go to paradise?
They don't know. Yeah, that's why it's
Assurance.
no assurance. Yeah, and that's something you want to stress with them. Just like with Roman Catholics, you want to bring that up. Okay, the fifth, Muslims believe.
What are the two blanks before? I didn't get them. Sincere confession and blank.
Good works. Muslims believe in a resurrection of the body and a final judgment, when Allah will weigh on a balance one's good and bad deeds to determine the eternal destiny of him or her. So they're like us. They believe in a resurrection of the body and a judgment. A lot of similarity. So having looked briefly at the Islamic faith or belief system, we'll look briefly at the Islamic practices. All Muslims are to engage in or observe what are known as the 5 pillars of Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam. First is the testimony of faith, or the Shahada, as it's called. It's the most important pillar. This is how you become a Muslim. If you want to turn from your non-Muslim way of life and become a Muslim, you simply say with conviction, there is no true God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, or Muhammad is the messenger of God, or Muhammad is his Rasul, as you see it stated sometimes. And this is often stated in their prayers. It's not just said one time at the beginning of their life, it's repeated many, many times. There is no true God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. The second, prayer 5 times a day. You could pray more, but there are 5 times during the day that you should pray towards Mecca. I didn't put that in there, but towards Mecca.
Is it just 5 that you're choosing, or are there certain hours?
There are certain times. Mm-hmm. The third, giving 2.5% of one's income to the poor and needy. So they have a doctrine of alms that you should give 1/40 of your income to the poor and needy. And it's called zakat, if you ever see that, Z-A-K-A-T in their writing. The fourth, with which most of us are familiar and getting ever more familiar, with the more Muslims that work with you, you fast. Ramadan, fasting from food, drink, and sex during the daylight hours of Ramadan, which roughly coincides with October. They're on a lunar calendar versus a solar calendar, so it's not exactly October. It's the 9th month of the Islamic lunar calendar, Ramadan. You fast from those three things during the day. So you better have a good breakfast. And then the fifth pillar of Islam is that at one time during your life, at some point during your life, as long as you can afford it, or you're physically able, you take a pilgrimage to the Haram Mosque in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And once you do that, you're called a Hajj, H-A-J-J. So the Hajj is the pilgrimage, and once you complete the Hajj, you can call yourself a Hajj.
So you introduce yourself, I'm the Hajj, Larry, or?
No, no. We just have about 3 minutes, and so it would be silly to try to refute Islam. I thought it was necessary. I don't know where all of you are at in your understanding of Islam, and still don't. So it was necessary that we at least cover this. Yes, Larry?
Since you've had quite a bit of experience in it, maybe if you could prepare us an outline of resources that we could start here and eventually, I guess, read the Quran. But
Yes.
that seems like that would be useful.
Yes, I have a plan, and I did this with the church in Oklahoma. Is at the end of the series, I have a resource list, and it'll include a lot on Islam. Yes. Bob Morey, I like him and have a lot of respect for him. He's a Christian apologist, Bob Morey, M-O-R-E-Y. And in fact, I was going to bring it today. I have a tract titled Muhammad and Jesus Christ. And it's pretty good. Maybe I'll provide that as a resource with the list of resources. It's a good tract. Yes, sir.
Isn't it true that the Quran itself, even though they consider it their holy word of God, has underwent, I think it's either 4 or 6 different revisions since the time it was originally written? There have been additions to the Quran at least 4 or 6 times since its writing.
Yes, everybody hear the question? I don't know the number of revisions, just like I couldn't tell you about the quote-unquote revisions and all the textual tradition of the Bible. But the textual history of the Quran is not seamless. There's been, there's what's been called, in history, there's called the Uthmanic recension. There was a time shortly after the death of Muhammad in the 7th century when all of the different Quranic parts were called in upon pain of death. And so you have a leader of Islam at that point in history, and he demands that all of the statements of Muhammad that were heard by people, or his followers recorded this, or this hadith, all of those things were called in, and if you didn't, you risked your life in not giving up the different manuscripts, what we would call manuscripts, that form the basis of the Quran. And all of those were burned. But not all of them, I should say, because there have been scriptoriums that have been discovered that have contained, and you'll see this in the article to which I referred you in the Atlantic Monthly from 1999, that contain manuscripts that disagree with the Arabic, with the Quran, which poses a real problem, because in Islam, the claim is made, according to the Quran, that the Quran and the other holy books are they're the inscripturation of an eternal book. And so there can't be variance by definition, because it's an eternal book. And so the long answer to that question is that there are variations to the Quran, even though they don't want you to think that. There is a textual history with which we should be familiar. But you don't have to be familiar with it. You can just, as we'll show next time, take the Quran as it is. It refutes itself, and therefore provides or demonstrates that it's not a viable worldview. And so, seriously, in the next period, we're going to take about 10 or 15 minutes and refute Islam. It's not hard. And I think you'll be very happy once you hear it, It doesn't require you to memorize a bunch of information. It would be helpful to memorize some references in the Quran when you sit down with a Muslim to show that for any rational person, Islam ought to be rejected as a spurious worldview. So please come next time, because you didn't get to hear